Selamat malam rekan-rekan yang ada di Indonesia. Kita berjumpa lagi dalam edisi yang ke-168 dari Theovlogy. Dan edisi kali ini super istimewa karena admin Theovlogy hanya 2, sementara ada 3 tamu istimewa di sini. Nah, tapi saya harus stop berbahasa Indonesia dan sekarang saya akan menyapa rekan-rekan dan juga tamu istimewa kita dalam bahasa Inggris. So, friends, today we are thrilled to have Professor Jeannine Fletcher in our 168th edition of our Theovlogy live stream interviews. And this is the second live stream in English. The first one we had with Professor Jamie Pitts from the Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary in Elkhart, Indiana, earlier this month. And we have a very special guest here. Dr. Fletcher is currently Professor of Theology at the Department of Theology at Fordham University in New York. She teaches at the intersection of systematic theology and the issues of diversity, be it religious diversity, Christian cultural diversity, race and gender. A constructive theologian in a Catholic Jesuit university. Her research and teaching explore the role of theological thinking in shaping public discourse, including both activism and legislation. Dr. Fletcher grew up in a suburb in Chicago and attended the University of Illinois as an undergraduate, majoring in English. And after a year with the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, she attended Harvard Divinity School, earning her MTS, Master of Theological Studies, and doctorate in theology from Harvard University. She joined Fordham faculty in 2001. So wow, it's almost 20 years at Fordham, Jeannine. And Dr. Fletcher has published 3 books and numerous articles. Her first book, Monopoly of Salvation, A Feminist Approach to Religious Pluralism. Her second book is Motherhood as Metaphor Engendering Interreligious Dialogue. And the most recent, The Sin of White Supremacy, Christianity, Racism, and Religious Diversity in America, which was honorably mentioned in the category of Faithful Citizenship by the Catholic Press Association Awards 2018. Professor Jeannine Fletcher, thank you very much for your time, for joining us in this interview.
I'm so glad to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Indeed. And we are also pleased that Theovlogy's good friend, Dr. Hans Harmakaputra, who is now still at St. John's University in Collegeville, Minnesota, is with us. Hans is moving to Hartford Seminary in Connecticut soon to occupy visiting assistant professor in Islam, Christian relations, and comparative theology at the school. I still remember, Dr. Fletcher, your first book was introduced to me by Hans many years ago. And as he already mentioned, he made use of your book in his senior thesis. And we are also pleased to have our third guest and our good friend, Brother Elia Maggang from the University of Manchester in England. About a month ago, Elia showed on his Facebook timeline that he was reading your book, Jeannine, Sin of White Supremacy. It was just perfect, I thought, to have Elia also to be our guest. And more surprising to me, Jeannine also told me that she spent a year at the University of Manchester as an undergraduate student. So I hope that this session would be more conversational, informal, and collegial. And we are hoping to have a robust conversation. robust dialogue among us, and later with the audience. So let me turn over the time to Professor Hugh Fletcher. And Jeannine, why did you, as a white Christian, feminist, and constructive theologian, write this book? And why did you choose the title, The Sin of White Supremacy? So the time is yours now.
That's a great set of questions. I hope I covered them all. And thank you for that glorious introduction and all of the connections that we have. I'll just note that the interconnection of this conversation, the book itself came out of an interconnection. It came out of a relationship that I had with the Dorothy Day Center for Service and Justice at my university. So it came out of work that I was doing, but over on the side of being a theologian, right? And so one of the things that struck me, Nindyo, as you were presenting the long history of the work that I've done, is that I could be a perfectly good white Catholic theologian and write those books and earn those degrees and never once say a word about white supremacy, right? And so kind of biographically, the work I had done was on issues of religious diversity, but I always had an attention to the ways in which the liberation theologies that I had been introduced to probably in high school and then all the way through my graduate work, the sense that the theologian is supposed to be attentive to what's going on in the world. So I was working with our service learning program. This is what, if you can Google and get access to the first part of the book. So if you haven't accessed it, you can see that I tell this story that I was kind of shaped to think that as a Christian, I should be involved in the world. So I had engaged in a variety of kind of service programs, and I was really compelled by the project of service learning, which is bringing academic conversations into engagement with the local community and thinking about how our work at the university is in partnership with what's going on in the world. For those of you who may not know, but Nindyo does, Fordham University is located in the Bronx in New York City, which is a largely Latino and Black and really culturally and racially diverse location. But it's also significantly impacted by the disparity of economic resources in the US. The university, however, is a predominantly white institution, right? It has historically served white students, and it now is attentive to and really committed to being a diverse institution, but it remains predominantly white, just statistically, and also maybe conceptually in many ways. So I was doing this work as a theologian involved in the local community of color, as a white theologian, and really recognizing the challenges that people in the community faced as being challenges of our human struggle for wellness, our human struggle for wholeness, and for access to those things that will make us thrive. Well, all of those realities are realities that the liberation theologian says we need to be attentive to. But for too long, white theologians have thought about their involvement in that reality from kind of the outside, right? That this is a reality that I need to be attentive to, but what does it really have to do with me, right? That this is a problem that I'm concerned about, but it's something that I choose to be concerned about, right? And I think that was the pattern that we saw in the service learning program, was that really good-hearted people, really good-hearted white Christians said, yeah, I want to be involved in transforming the world, but I kind of have a choice of whether or not to do that, right? And as I continued to do that work, I had a wonderful mentor who said, yeah, we can't do this work without the resources of an anti-racist lens, which had been very eye-opening to me, that I inhabited a white way of seeing the world. So with these resources of anti-racism training, and with the liberation theologians' call to be attentive to the world, I began a new sort of education, right, that I hadn't really received as a theologian. And one of the most compelling moments in this education, I'll just share the screen to give you the visual of this. One of the most compelling moments in this new education was encountering this data. So you need to let me know that you can, this is the first time I'm using the system. You need to let me know that you can see the slide that is the data on wealth in the US. You can see that?
It would be better if you, what is that?
Slideshow.
Maximize slideshow that, Jeannine.
Slideshow it.
Next to animation and review. No.
Oops, it's gone.
Okay. Once I share it, I can no longer see the things that, so let me, maybe you can help me. I will share it.
Yes.
Yes. You
yes.
can see that.
And then, yeah, the third button at the, yes, that one.
Okay, so that is what I had done, but it did not change for you.
Oh, it didn't work. Okay, okay.
So you don't see it as a big slide?
Yep.
Yeah, we don't see that as a big slide.
Do you want me to operate the slide?
Sure. Yeah, why don't we, you have the slides?
Yes.
Yes.
I have.
Okay, so
for a moment.
This is big anticipation for those who are watching, right? What is the slide? All right, the next slide. The next slide.
Awesome.
This is the slide.
Next one. Yes. Okay. Awesome.
All that drama was worth the wait. I knew that economic disparity was a reality in my world. So this is data from the US. I knew that poverty disproportionately impacted people of color in the United States. But I didn't experience it as the very structure of the world that I inhabited. I experienced it as a problem of some communities. I experienced it as something out there in my world, but not something that was directly related to my experience in the world until I saw this data. And the sheer clarity of the sinful reality that some members of my society can have 20 times the access to well-being measured in wealth than their neighbors. And that this didn't happen by accident. This happened out of a history that dedicated resources to white citizens and kept people of color from access. It was this data that helped me to see that I was living in a world structured by white supremacy. Right? That white supremacy wasn't something that the neo-Nazis were only responsible for, or the KKK. But if I, as a white person in this country, inhabit a location that has benefited from a full history of dedicating resources to white citizens and keeping them from people of color, then I have to own my own embeddedness in the reality of white supremacy. And I have to name it, as a theologian, as a condition of sin. A condition of sin that everyone in my society is responsible for. Not those who are negatively impacted, but those of us who have positively benefited from this sinful situation. Right? So those theologians who help us to think about structural sin, right, helped me to read this reality as something that was calling me to respond, right? Not out of the goodness of my heart, but out of the depths of my own embeddedness in this sinful reality. So the book essentially is my attempt to make sense of this reality to help others see this reality, and then from a Christian perspective to respond and to engage in this reality. So the next 2 slides just provide. If you pause on this slide here, they just provide some of the theoretical framing of the book, right? When we think about white supremacy or we think about racism, we too often think about it as a particular form, what Camara Phyllis Jones describes as the form of personally mediated racism. And if you advance the slide one more, you'll see that I've underlined the centerpiece here, that most of us, I don't know if that's accurate, but many times, right, when we think about racism, we might be thinking about these individual acts of prejudice and discrimination, right? And surely white supremacy is manifest in that way, but that alone doesn't help me to make sense of that data slide of economic inequality along racial lines. So Camara Phyllis Jones offers another form of racism. If you advance the slide, you'll see she wants us to be attentive to institutionalized racism. Advancing it once more will give us the underlining here, right? That institutionalized racism isn't just the interpersonal encounters of meanness or discrimination. Institutionalized racism reflects more that slide of a differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. It's this form of racism that is the racism of white supremacy that I am deeply impacted by, and that I wanted my readers to really share in this perspective of us all being responsible for it. But institutionalized racism is very difficult to see. So if you advance it once more, and you have to keep advancing to 1, 2, 3, you'll see on the left-hand side, right, that personally mediated racism is this form. It's interpersonal, it's actions, it's visible. If you keep advancing to that other side, you'll see that institutionalized white supremacy is structural, it's systemic, and it's often invisible, which is why white Christians don't feel themselves responsible, because they can't see it. They can say, well, I'm not mean to people of color. I'm not engaged in those discriminatory actions, right? But if I benefit from institutions, right, that direct resources toward me and deny them to people of color, then I am involved and I am responsible. So the project of the first part of the book is really trying to unpack that structural systemic lens. And I'll just advance the next slide to give you a sense of how I tried to do that. That this reality isn't a reality that dropped from the sky. It's a reality that comes from out of a history or a sedimentation of racial inequality. And so the first part of the book is trying to illuminate that, is trying to make the case that if we look in a particular way at our history, we will see this. Advance one more, and then this is going to go rather quickly here, that institutionalized white supremacy can be made visible, right, if we read our history in a particular way. If we see the way that U.S. legislation gave differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of the nation along racialized lines. And all of that is important, and all of that was part of my own re-education. But I also did not see that Christian theology and Christian ideas and Christian scripture was actually informing this legislation in the broad periods of U.S. history. So I have just 4 slides that will give you a sense of what I tried to do in my work. That is, tell the story of U.S. legislation that gave differential access to people in a racialized way, that benefited white Christians in this country, and that was underwritten by theology and scripture and religious reasoning. So the first chapter is simply, if you advance, the first chapter is simply that the land that was stolen from indigenous people benefited white Americans, right? And that we can see, my formatting here didn't make the transition, but what you would see there is that the language of Genesis being fruitful and multiplying and subduing the earth, was actually used by legislators, right, over the first period of colonial history and then what becomes U.S. history, was used by white Christians to say, well, the indigenous people aren't doing what God wanted them to do. They aren't fulfilling that command to be fruitful and settle and multiply and subdue the earth. They are living in a different way on this land. And what God designed is that Christians, right, should discover this land and should supersede the indigenous nation's right to occupancy. And that was actually written into U.S. law in 1823 with the Johnson v. McIntosh decision. Okay, that's the first chapter. Second chapter, on the next slide, is the big picture of unpaid labor over the many generations of white Christians who used our scripture and our theological reasoning to defend enslavement in systems of unpaid labor that transferred wealth. The wealth that comes from generations of work transferred that wealth into the hands of white Americans and white institutions. That chapter is an important chapter that I never learned as a theologian, and so reading that chapter through the lens of the theological underpinnings of the economy of enslavement was another piece of my re-education. Two more chapters of my re-education. The third chapter here, the ways in which legislation in the 19th century empowered white citizens. Again, something like the Homestead Act, which transferred land and opportunity to from indigenous peoples and their relation to the land to white citizens in the U.S., but also things like establishing land grant universities and the system of public education, public higher education, through that land transfer, right? So we're seeing in this history the transfer of resources from people of color, from indigenous people to white Americans. And in this legislative chapter, Christian theology being used in lots of different ways. And then the final chapter that I would include here as we move into the 20th century, the way in which legislation that helped homeowners build their wealth in the 20th century, which is in the US, homeownership is, I think, the single most important element in a wealth portfolio. That home ownership that was supported by government programming, government programs, was provided access to wealth building for white Americans. But the very program itself was enacted in such a way that it was embedded in systems of white supremacy, ideologies of white supremacy that denied access to mortgages to people of color through the project that's known as redlining, but also through mortgage lending manuals that ran all the way through the 20th century. So those are some among the major chapters of of my re-education that helped me to understand a little bit better. I think if we go to the next slide, it returns us to that sedimentation of racial inequality. And so the book is aimed both to illuminate that reality, to call white Christians to feel responsible for that reality, and also because of the benefits that white American Christians have received from that unjust reality, but also to call theologians in a particular way to task. The way in which our discipline made all of this transfer of wealth and opportunity reasonable, and in fact justifiable, and even a project that was seen as part of God's will for the nation. So I think that brings us up to speed with kind of the foundational project of the book. And I think that I can now stop sharing the screen and ask our colleagues who have been thinking about this with me to help us open up some other spaces from this. And my question to you, I don't know if I was supposed to do this, but here I go. My question to you is, in what ways does the knowledge of this history give us a place from which to ask theologians to do some sort of work? Right, that the whole point of the book is, look, I never knew this history. I never knew this history. I never felt responsible for it, right? I could be a white theologian and I could talk about God and church and Jesus. And I would never once have to talk about this devastating structure of the humanity that I inhabited. So I'm curious if there are folks who have some thoughts about what the theologian is supposed to do in light of this.
Yeah.
Please, Hans.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jeannine, for the presentation. Responding to your question, I think one of the things that theologian can do is to interrogate their assumption regarding race, because I feel myself that theologians often repeat the colorblind rhetoric, and that implies their way of teaching the student, and it reflects on the syllabus. So when I studied this topic myself a few years back, I read your books, I read other womanist Black theologians' work. I started by changing my own syllabus. So when I teach Christian ethics, I do not teach only topics that usually covered by Catholic school like Boston College, but I include this profound issue of racism, of structural racism in it, and that gives some unpleasing situation with me and the students in the beginning. But that I found your book helpful because, one of the counter rhetoric to Black Lives Matter movement is that, okay, this is just some people doing this kind of demonstration and this kind of work. This is something not objective. But having people like you who are white person writing this book give more emphasis that this is not only the issue of some people or colored people. This is the issue of all, and if we are Christian, we have to address this issue.
So let me follow up with that with a question that I've been puzzling over myself. Is there such a thing as theology without attention to our racialized locations in producing that theology, right? So my generation, and I hope things may have changed by the time each of you have been going through your training, but my generation, it was, well, here's theology, and then we have contextual theologies over here, right? And so that fundamental recommendation, Hans, that you're making, that theology can't be colorblind, right? And that theology never was actually colorblind, but that we might have to rename some theology curricula as white theology. Do you think that'll go over? Do you think anyone's going to say, this syllabus today, right, in this class, we're covering white theology as produced by the classic white theologians of Europe?
Yeah, I think that will really
depends
on the structure. But I myself try to subvert the system by providing diverse authors. So I try not to really disrupt the whole system, like visibly disrupt it, but I try a subtle form of changing the system from within by providing students with different voices. But I would like to know what other people respond.
Well, I somewhat agree that there is a kind of a myth of neutrality that Christian faith, Christian theology is neutral. We have this bulk of Christian faith, Christian theology, never investigating or interrogating that where it came from. And when we talk about theology, we often, as a Christian growing up in Indonesia, we never talk about who did this interpretation? Who produced that theology? Even though we inherit the theology from not only from European world, but also from North American world. But we often think that, or the theology that was taught to me is, this is the theology. And so if there is some destructions in the society, or even some protests like what we are witnessing today, this is sin. The sin is on the part of the protesters, never investigating or interrogating the structure, the sinful structure.
And Nindyo, as you were talking about the myth of neutrality, this work is ongoing, and so after the book, I really started then overturning all sorts of things and saying, okay, well, who produced this work, and what don't I know about the theologian who produced this work? And it runs the risk of ruining things when you start finding the answers to those questions. But one of the rocks that I overturned that I had never expected to, but that came to mind as you were speaking about this myth of neutrality, is that the author of the hymn "Amazing Grace," right? We all know "Amazing Grace." We love that song. That's just theology dropped from the sky, right? The author of that hymn is reflecting on an experience that he had while he was, I think, the captain on a ship at sea, right? And so he has his little place where he can retreat, and he describes being out on the sea and just having this rapturous experience with God, but then also the trouble of the waves and the sea. And I thought I was lost, but now I've been saved, right? And he reflects on that, and it kind of makes its way into that hymn, Amazing Grace. But the ship that he's on is a slave ship. The ship that he is on, having this profound theological experience that makes its way into the classic Christian hymns, is a ship in which those below him are enslaved and have been captured. Right, and so this idea that theology is neutral, this idea that theology is somehow not embedded in the long chapter of an economy of enslavement, but then it ruins things, right? It ruins things, right? I don't want to sing Amazing Grace anymore. What do I do with that lovely theology when I know that it was produced in the most dehumanizing conditions, and has benefited a white Christian tradition, and not just a white Christian tradition, but in any case, it kind of ruins things.
Yes, yeah, that's right. When you mentioned Isaac Newton, I remember Dr. Howard Thurman's book, because it was quoted in this book also.
And Howard Thurman, so I can't remember whether that was the book that I was visiting when I went and I found that I pursued that on my own. But Thurman was writing this in Jesus and the Disinherited is 1940 something.
Yes, 1949.
Jesus and the Disinherited read Jesus through the lens of empire. But how long did it take for biblical scholarship to really embrace that to the point where theologians today say the message of the gospel is an anti-imperial message? So, Indio.
That's really true. I pointed that out to my students when I did the class, and we read this together. Before the historical Jesus scholarship, especially related to the empire studies, Howard Thurman has talked about that. And he pointed out correctly that Isaac Newton was complicit in the slavery and slave market. But yeah, and this is fascinating for me, Jeannine. But I let my folks, my friends who want to say something about this.
Yeah, me. Yeah, from Manchester. Yeah, I I'm really thankful for this book because it helps me in many ways in my work now. But yeah, it reminds me of something as you displays in this book a trajectory history of how the white supremacy is built and then now becomes a serious issue in US. And I have because I'm also constructing a theology, so I have this your book reminds me of something that I have to be careful in constructing a theology. What I read from your book is that some group of people, white people, know God, believe in God, and then they it seems like they own this God. So it's not only about land ownership but also God ownership. So they because they want they think that God does everything for them for their interest, and then that leads them to manipulate the Bible, the scriptures, as if the scriptures is the way God works for their interest. So from their ownership, and then they own God and they manipulate God to fulfill their desire, their interest, and so on. So I think for me as a theologian that I learned that if you want to construct a theology, if you want to do theology, then you cannot do it yourself as if God is your object, and then you try to comprehend God, you master God, because it has a tendency to make me manipulate anything that I learn from the Bible to support my idea, my ideology. So yeah, that's the point that I think is important, and I find you offer some fundamental point for me, for myself. You talk about the ghostly grace in chapter 5.
I like that. Yes,
it's
I
fascinating. That's interesting. You talk about Jesus who always haunts you with his body, with his suffering on the cross, that always haunts you. So to make you always feel that someone, the Lord that you believe, is haunting you, and he wants to make sure that you do what he was doing 2,000 years ago. So I think that is important. So to be a theologian that always happy to be haunted by the love of Christ.
Elia, you have to let me know if you're planning on coining that term God ownership, because I think it's really, really useful. I think, and so when you start to publish things that use the term God ownership, I'm going to reference them or somehow recognize it. I think it's really, really useful. I think it's exactly what we see in the history. And I also think people will have to talk about their own experience in the discipline, but there is sometimes a desire for mastery over God, right? And that theology somehow is going to allow us to be in control of the uncontrollable mystery. It's like, well, that should be antithetical to what we're trying to do, and nevertheless, it seems to keep reappearing. It definitely is what has happened in Christian history in the U.S., right? This sense that, of course I know what God wants, right? And God wants the well-being of me, right? And so the kinds of ways that the gospel is interpreted to elevate the winners, right? And the kind of way in the US and probably in other places around the globe, the way in which wealth and power and prestige seem to carry with them ideas that these people have been blessed in a particular way, right? By that God's favor has kind of elevated them, not the sin of white supremacy elevating them, but God elevating them, right? It's all of a piece there. But the and I think that I probably experienced this quite powerfully from James Cone in his Cross and the Lynching Tree, with the God who haunts us, because the Christian affirmation isn't just about a God who cares for humanity. The Christian affirmation, when we read that story, is of a God who resides in the one who has been broken, a God who resides in the crucified one, right? And so reading that message, when we ask the question, where is God in the world, we should be drawn to those places in our world where there is brokenness, where people have been devastated, where suffering is happening, right? And so as a white theologian, I should have been entering my liturgical space. And so as a Catholic, the ghost who haunts is the physical, in the Catholic liturgical space, the crucifix has the broken and bloody body of Jesus hanging from it. And so every single time I entered that space, I should have been asked the question, how is God haunting you in this place to remind you to seek God in the broken in the world? But that's not the way it worked, right? That the white Jesus kind of hung there and is like, oh, I guess that's too bad. There's a conceptual, break there. And so I think part of that invitation to be haunted by that ghostly grace of God resident in the body of Jesus broken, a body of Christ broken, is also an incredibly rich messaging, but that is not one that arrived at me through my liturgical practice. It arrived to me through James Cone, right, and his Cross and the Lynching Tree. So thanks for bringing that piece in, because I think that's one of the places where the richness of theology, the richness of the Christian story being retold, hasn't worked through a white racial lens, and really needed Cone's analysis to help me see that broken body was a haunting, right, rather than an artifact from the past.
Yeah.
I saw Hans' hand. Yes. So I want to follow up this point. So when people read your book, there is a strong emphasis on the sin of Christianity, right? What Christianity had done wrong in the past related to racism, and I think some people usually argues that, well, that's in the past. We should not just throw the baby together with the water. But yesterday I read a short article who says, well, if the situation is really that destructive and wrong, why don't we just totally destroy it? But as a Christian, of course, I don't want to destroy Christianity. So I found listening to the voice of the crucified people really helpful in this matter. I remember Kelly Brown Douglas' Black Christ book. It's been published many years ago, but in there she provides narratives of how Black people appropriate Christianity that is different from the slave owner Christianity. So instead of just reading several passages, they take the core of the gospel, that is liberation and freedom, and that they keep it in their heart. And I think this is something that for Catholic theology, I'm not a Catholic, but I studied at Catholic University, so I know a little bit of Catholic theology. I think that's the Catholic point of preferential option for the poor, that seeing from the eyes of the poor is like seeing from the eyes of God, and listening to their voice is important. And that relates to the issue of neutrality. When people just say this is theology is neutral. There is no racial aspect in that. No, if you see it from the experience of the people who are oppressed, who are crucified, you see that there are troubles. And listening to it and trying to repair the situation, and by repairing means you have to destroy something, that might be the future of Christianity, by listening to the different people and try to adjust to that perspective, and not just holding the Christianity that built from one perspective.
But I'm following all the way, and I think that we have to keep coming back to the refrain that theology is not neutral, right? That it has been interpreted in all of these different ways. And I'm of two minds at the moment in terms of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. That there is a reclaiming that goes on in our constructive work that isn't quite throwing everything out. But the other part of my mind says, well, why wouldn't I want to throw out the white supremacist ideologies that have been written into my faith tradition? Like, if what I'm dismantling is the sinful structure of white supremacy, then yes, that does need to be destroyed, right? And so it's not, I don't think it's ever been the case that Christianity has only been used for white supremacist ends. It certainly isn't the case that Christianity has only been used for oppression. And so that hermeneutic lens of the preferential option for the poor, but how seriously do we really take that? And I own my own North American context, right? And I own the ways in which that gospel is articulated, and it is mobilizing people, and it continues to run, all the way from the founding of the country to today, the liberationist approach, where people have said the white supremacist interpretation of the biblical text is not the gospel, right? And yet, there's a sizable population that doesn't see it that way, right? So I guess my strongest point there is, yes, if it means destroying something that we can name as sinful, then yes, perhaps we need to do those things. And so this goes back to the question that I think Nindio posed: why do I name it the sin of white supremacy? Right? It's not just an individual failure. It's not just mean-spirited people. It's a sinful reality that we are embedded in, right? And so let's mobilize the gospel to transform that as people of faith.
Then my question, in reading again your book, you talk about the sinful structure of white supremacy. And what I hear from you is that white supremacy might not be redeemed because it is very destructive to the society. But then what does redemption mean as a constructive theologian? Is it your next project then? Or, I don't know. But yeah, I'm intrigued to ask that to you. So what is your next project? Oh, no.
No. And I think that this is the, the places where I will have to do a deeper study of the theological resources in the idea of redemption, right? What are the nuances within redemption? Because the place that I go to, and I'm inviting us into a live conversation here, the place that I go to is repair and reparation and rebalance and shifting the benefits to envision a transformed world. And so some of those ideas must map onto redemption. But I suspect that there's even more nuances within the idea of redemption that we could open up and work with, right? I mean, that's what Christians are called to do. And I'm happy to situate this for now as a Christian theologian in the kind of Christian worldview and thematic. Christians are called to repair the world. Christians are called to not just say, oh, this is a sinful situation, but to actually be involved in that. My own theology lends itself to the place of saying we're called to be involved in that redemption, right? And so I don't know, maybe you could help me think about whether reparation maps onto themes in the nuances of redemption. You know, I move toward so the sin of white supremacy used the framing of Walter Rauschenbusch, right? To say we don't live in a kingdom of God, we live in a kingdom of evil. That's how he framed it in the early part of the 20th century. He wasn't looking at white supremacy, but I used that framing to say I live in a kingdom of evil. And as a Christian, I'm called to the transformation toward the kingdom of God, right? So those are the theological themes that I lean toward, but I'm curious whether redemption, like what are the themes within the nuances of redemption that would lend themselves to this work?
Well, this is not a well thought idea, but when you said about reparations, I remember the Jewish idea of tikkun olam, mending the world or repairing the world. Probably that idea can also be dialogued with Christian theology. I don't know.
But I guess it would. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
No, I think confessing. No, I mean, while I'm reading your book, I think it's the most interesting part for me is like you're a white people, but you're confess that there's a problem with the white society. I think that part, just confessing there's something problem in my own society. I think that's part of redemption. That's my thought, I guess. Why I say this? I heard an opinion say that like if there's a racism, the problem is not from the Christianity itself, but it's just people who use Christianity for their own benefit, like that. But I think while I'm reading your book, the problem is not only the people, but also the Christianity. I mean, in the white space, I think. So so for me, confessing our crime, confessing our sin, I think it's part of redemption for me. That's a start.
But you've also just opened up one of the. I'm really glad you brought that in because that is one of the theological commitments that I make. Is that in the history of the U.S., Christian supremacy, right, was a foundation for the racialized categorizations of white supremacy. Right, so the ideas that we might have to be willing to let go of is the very idea that Jesus is the best, to put it kind of simply, right? And so the question of what are the ways that Christian theology might need to be rethought? Can we be anti-racist and still hold on to the idea that Christianity is the best religion? Well, that seems to be rather contradictory. But it will require Christian theologians to really revisit the central claims of the tradition. And I don't think that we're doing this from nowhere. I mean, there's been generations of comparative theologians, right? And Hans, maybe you would want to say something, right, about, just the intersection in this country of racial diversity and religious diversity. Well, one of the reasons why the many and widespread attacks on people in the tradition of Islam, right, is because of a Christian hegemony and a Christian notion that, well, they're not just people of other backgrounds and other races, but they're also not Christian. I mean, I don't know if you have any insights that come from out of the comparative world on what needs to happen theologically.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree that somehow racism and white supremacy is linked very strongly with Christian supremacy, as you stated in your book. And as someone who studied theology of religions, I also aware that Christian theologians have been critical to the ways in which Christians portray the status of other people in their eyes. And I would say that it's totally well, how should I formulate it? I would say that it's hard to say that Christianity it's not the best religion because it's something more personal. So I use the lens of epistemology. So when I say Christianity or Jesus is my savior, I say it from the lens of language that's the grammar of faith that nurtures me and from which I see the world. However, I cannot just see other people and their experience from my own perspective, and that's I think the positive point of comparative theology. Because as a Christian, I'm willing to dig deeper into the Islamic tradition. In my case, I study Islam. I really see Islam from the perspective of Muslims who see that the sources, who see their history, and not as a Christian. And then that helps me to formulate my own position and interrogate what's wrong with Christians' perspective toward Muslims.
Yeah.
And I think that is one way to solve the issues of Christian supremacy, because we can find the language of salvation in many religions, but Christianity has an issue with power because of colonialism that makes Christianity above the others in terms of power and could be able and be able to impose their perspective to others. And as a result, you can see the language similar to Christian supremacy develop in other religious traditions. So maybe that's my initial response. But this is very interesting. That would be a different topic.
Yeah. But to give you a context too, Jeannine, as you know that in Indonesia, known as the largest Muslim population in the world, whereas Christians are minority in Indonesia, the story can be quite different from the US, right? In one way, Christianity came to Indonesia as a colonial religion, but since Christians are minority, what I get is people need a kind of security, a kind of identity, and they find it in Christian theology or in Christian faith.
Yeah.
Well, it can be destructive, of course, but yeah, the idea of security and this is my identity. If I lose it, so where I can get comfort. And so in one way, I see that apologetics is very well known in Indonesia. But what I try to see from the different perspective, is it a kind of securing my identity in the midst of pressures and religious tensions in my country? Yosia, you want to say more about this?
I think Piggy right in on Nindyo's thought. I think that's right. So the consequence from the Christian minority in Indonesia, I think the Christianity in Indonesia tend to compromise with more colonialized Christianity more than the vulnerable Christianity like that. So yeah, I mean it's related with my past response to you, that I think it's hard maybe. I mean, while I reading your book, the question that haunt me is like, do I make a same mistake like that? You know, do my clan have, or my people have racial bias or something like that to other people? But that's another issue. But what I want to say is, so it's like the story that we try to leave it on is like more colonialized Christianity. That's what I want to say. Yeah, just figure out.
But if we circle back around to what's at the center of that identity, if the center of that identity is the crucified one, and I don't necessarily think that every Christianity has the crucified one at its center,
Yes,
right?
yes.
But if the crucified one is at the center, then questions of identity and security are changed, right? Because what is the security of the crucified one? It's a willingness to give oneself over and be rather insecure, right? The other theological component that I just think is so missing in my own location, and I don't know what it looks like in your location, right? But you know, so this is Karl Rahner that has never left me. He haunts me as well. That my security and my identity are in the face of this vast ocean of mystery. Like, well, what kind of security and identity is that? It's like, no. So I can't help but go back to the line that I love the most from Rahner, which is his opening from Foundations of Christian Faith. What do Christians love more? Our island of so-called knowledge, our security, our identity, or the ocean of infinite mystery, which is his name for God. Like, what do we love more? Right. And so I know that the context is quite different. But I'm wondering whether the interpretive emphases, right, aren't kind of showing patterns of a Christianity that tries to ground itself in security and power, and a Christianity that's willing to think about security and identity in a different way.
I like that. What I hear from you, Jeannine, is that this can be an invitation to revisit tradition from our respective traditions. Like mine as a Mennonite, probably the center of my identity or my faith tradition is the life of Jesus. And when we see the life of Jesus and the teaching of Jesus, so what does Jesus teach, and with whom Jesus walked, and with whom Jesus talked, and what is his idea? I think that's really important to revisit the core of our tradition.
But Nindio, sorry, Elia, you want to go? Let me just make one point. If you read that life of Jesus through an anti-imperial lens, or even just the lens of empire, right? And then you come back to our discipline and you ask, does our discipline walk with those who have been crushed by empire, or does our discipline trade in the power of empire? I just think that your invitation to go back to the life and teaching of Jesus, reading that through the lens of empire, might put a different light on the work that theologians do in our various locations of empire. But Elia, you had a
I want to push back to what the context of Indonesia, and I agree with Hans that the issue of power is very important. And although like Nindio and Yosia in Java, their Christianity in their place minority, but in my hometown, my place in eastern part of Indonesia, in East Nusa Tenggara, we are the majority, and we have the sense of power. We are the majority, and our history with the colonization it influences our mentality as Christians, that we have power and we can do everything with the power we have. That's why I think your notion of the ghostly grace is very fascinating for me, because in Indonesia, in my context, I have the privilege as a Christian in my hometown. We are the majority. So what is important for me is to be haunted by the insecurity. Jesus, who is vulnerable, who is not secure. So that is important for me in my context.
Me
too.
Jeannine, shall we open up from the floor? There are some responses and questions. This is from Dr. Arvin Go from Stanford. Do people adopt Eurocentric theology naively and uncritically because they assume it to be biblical? And then second question, thanks, Dr. Hill Fletcher. Do you see the Bible being abused consciously or unconsciously in the U.S. history to defend certain oppressive theological notions?
So I think I can see that those two questions are related. And I think that I would focus in for the moment on unconsciously in relation to both of those questions. I think that white theologians who have been trained with Eurocentric theological traditions, I don't know that they think that it's necessarily biblical, but I do think that they see that they experience the power resident in those Eurocentric forms of doing theology. So I don't think that they necessarily. That's a great question, because it distinguishes the field of theology from the field of biblical studies. And I'm not sure that I have that. I can come back to that answer if I think of something more to add to that. The second question, I wonder if it's not the same sort of unconsciously. I think that the use of the biblical text in the history that I have seen, I don't think that they thought of themselves as abusing the Bible. I mean, one of the maybe I put this back on those of us in the extended space here who are biblical scholars. One of the things that has been a change for me is that I kind of had the mindset that all of the people who were using the biblical text to defend slavery, right, were manipulating the Bible. But if you read the texts from the time, and it's John Henry Hopkins, who is the Bishop of Vermont in the middle of the 19th century. He says, let's look at the Bible and let's see slavery defended. And let's see the guidelines for slavery written into the Exodus account. And let's see the guidelines for slavery and what it means to hold other human beings. Let's see that in the Hebrew Bible. And let's see the fact that in the New Testament, the authors in the New Testament world clearly knew slavery as a thing and never really objected, right? And so the question of uncritically using the biblical text, I realized, wait, maybe the problem is within the biblical text itself, right? So I think that the biblical text is always ambiguous in terms of what does it finally say about something, that maybe there are competing messages within that text and that it has been used. And so Nindio will know that I'm a big fan of a method that says that my priority is how it's going to be used in the world, right? That's just myself as a theologian. I want to prioritize attention to what are the outcomes of this way of interpreting the text. I'm not sure I've answered that question.
I think that's great. Yeah.
Can I respond very quickly?
Sure. Yes, please.
Yeah. So I think I'm not sure whether it's conscious or unconscious, but I'm a fan of what's so-called reception history, and this is something that the people use. Well, there is a power relation. Again, it's about power, and because the white slave owner was the one in power, so they are the ones who can define what the interpretation means for them and for the slaves, right? And I think right now, I think it's important to dismantle the history of interpretations. So I like the work of Willie Jennings, for example, right? So it interrogates the text, and then the second, it moves us into a different direction. Namely, for me, the text is not only the Bible, but what matters is not only the Bible, but how we read it. How people who are oppressed read the Bible, and that becomes a new text, right? What the slaves do with the story of Jesus about liberation, and the hymns, African American hymns, becomes a new text for us to read alongside the Bible. So that's my response.
Yeah, yeah.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. From Barbary Chapman, she has some threads here. She's asking what is the next step in addressing the current racial impact of project. And then she also said reparations for Black Americans, apology is watered down. And then change racist and white supremacist government legislation drafted by the founding fathers. Legislation reform, education, healthcare, and social systems for people of color, especially Black Americans affected by slavery, Reconstruction era, and policing. What do you think, Jeannine?
So I think that the question is, what are the next steps? And I think that the question as posed lays out, right, the whole range of next steps. And I think that the very first, I don't know if it's really the first next step, but I think that theologians really have to think about ways that we partner with other disciplines, right? Because all of this work on reparations, it's all out there. The economists, the people who study tax law and legislation, and the people who are imagining what that redistribution might look like they've done a ton of work. How many white theologians in this country have read their work? How many white theologians in this country are thinking seriously about this variety of forms of repair? So the question that was laid out, right, is a really good question to say, look, so there's two things. One is, I'm not sure whether the question was saying, how do we choose which of those next steps to take, right? But I do hear that the question says, look, there are so many things that need to be done, right? And it does bring me back to the question in the beginning, like, should every theologian be somehow trying to address this in our context, if it really is the structure in which we live? And the next step for me, in relation to the question that's been asked, is to think even further about the ways in which that legislation from the past has created the conditions that continue to support my thriving through institutions, right? So what are the ways that, not just that this is a past history that has done damage to members of my community in the United States, but what are the ways that this history has actually empowered me, right? Through the institutions of education, through the institutions of the church, right? And so to be responsible, I think part of the project right now is looking at my own church, looking at my own university, looking at my own neighborhood, and asking the question, okay, if I benefit from these institutions, what do I need to do to trace the ill-gotten resources of these institutions? So I don't know whether that was whether that quite addresses the question, but I think that after knowing the history, one has to realize that history didn't disappear. The benefits of that unjust history have been transferred into institutions. And so how do we, who work in those institutions, how are we part of the systems of redistribution of those ill-gotten resources.
Well, thank you. I think that's great. This is a question from our friend Jeffrey Udampo. Dr. Hill Fletcher, if you have opportunity to preach before white supremacist congregation, what message or biblical passage that you would choose? It's hard.
So luckily, where's my book over here? Luckily, oh, there we go. Your question is so specific. Your question is so specific that I'm going to draw on the work. I don't know if other folks know this book yet, but Stephen Patterson's The Forgotten Creed. So because your question is so specific, there we go. I'm gonna make my answer so specific, and I'm going to imagine that, with Stephen Patterson, that if we go to Galatians 1:26 through 28, that's where I would go. And he says, look, we've got this original creed, and biblical scholars are going to help us get back to what scholars apparently believe, that this was the earliest creed of Christians, right? There is no Jew or Greek, no slave or free, no male and female, right? If that's the earliest creed, what happened? What happened, right? If so, I guess I would ask the white supremacist Christian congregation, right, to take seriously the work of biblical scholars that says, what would happen if we really took this creed and lived it, right? What would that mean as Christians who believe in the biblical text as a guide to our lives today? So yeah, I'm glad to have had Patterson to grab, because that's a tough question, because there's so many places that one would want to go in calling people out, right? So there's this distinction that's being made, calling people out, naming the white supremacist ideologies, requiring that white people face their own ideologies of supremacy. But there's another strategy of calling people in, right? Finding those places where we have shared values. And the reason that I take this question seriously is that I don't think that most white supremacist congregations understand themselves to be white supremacist congregations. I think they understand themselves to be Christian communities. I think so many of them would be appalled that we were naming them as white supremacist, right? And so finding the places in the biblical text that would help us to open that up. Patterson's book, which I highly, highly recommend, is so beautiful and wonderful and compelling in this creed. But then he says it never really did take root, right? That almost immediately Paul is making accommodations with all of these things. And so, the story of the Christian faith as a story that could have been and never quite was, and yet Christians are called into making it a reality. I don't know. You can line me up. You can line me up with those white supremacist congregations and see if they want to.
But it is fascinating that you pointed out Galatians 1 as the earliest creed, I think, and that makes the question from Bunglon Theology can also be nuanced. For me, what does it mean to have throwing? Yeah, what does it mean to have the throwing out the creed? Like, nice creed. Is it white? Question.
It's a very good question. It is supremacist. It states rather clearly that Jesus is the only Son of God. right? And so I do think it has the seeds of supremacy all the way back to the creed. But it also has the seeds of anti-supremacy, right? I've been compelled by all of those places in the creed that, do I believe that God is Father, right? As a feminist theologian, right? Do I believe that Jesus is the only Son of God, right? But then I get down to the part of this about the Spirit, right? The one who has spoken through the prophets. That's a God I believe in, right? That's a God that I think is at work in the world. And so the question that was asked, what do we throw out, is a really, and I think that maybe I revisit that. The work that I'm doing right now, I'm not sure we can tear down all of the statues that witness to white supremacy, because as a conversation partner once said, you'll just tear down everything that is, right? And the truth of how deeply white supremacy has been embedded in our tradition is a significant challenge, and ideologies of supremacy embedded in our tradition. And so I'm not so sure I think that the elements of, I think it's the strategy that maybe Hans referred to, and certainly Thurman presents. Like, there are elements of the tradition that are not liberative and that I won't write forward, right? But that doesn't mean I'm going to get Thomas Jefferson's version of the Bible, which excises anything that I don't like for the moment. I think that I have to wrestle with that sinful nature of my own tradition.
Well, I think this reminds me of Dr. Ebony's Thurman's book.
Marshall Thurman,
Thurman's book, I think. She revisits the Chalcedonian definition from the perspective of womanist theologians. And I think being a womanist theologian rereads the Chalcedonian definition. It's still a possibility, I think.
And I think that's the challenge, right? Is how do we inherit a tradition that has been used for particular ends, and how do we choose to continue to work with that tradition for ends that are more liberative?
I would like to say that I agree with what Jeannine said about the Nicene Creed might have the seed of supremacy. We have to remember that that's the beginning of Christians having more power. But if we go back to the Bible and can hear the word of Jesus is the Lord, that might have a different interpretation. I refer to George Krieger, Christ and Empire book. The Lord, Jesus is Lord means that Caesar is not the Lord. So something more different. And if we refer to the experience of slaves in the United States, that also gives something different. By stating that Jesus is the Lord, it's the only Lord, it means that my owner is not really my owner. Right? He is not the Lord. So there is an aspect of interpretation that could enrich our understanding of this text.
Great. Dr. Hill Fletcher, this is a response from Dr. Septami Lakawa. She is the principal of Jakarta Theological Seminary, where Hans got his bachelor. So it is really good if you get connected with Dr. Septami Lakawa. She's also a feminist, and she works in the area of trauma and theology. Reads, thank you for your perspective. Perhaps the problem lies in white hermeneutics in reading the Bible. It has grabbed the authority of the pulpit as a site of the prophetic voice. Blackness, on the other hand, has become an embodied text of resilience, where the prophetic voice has flourished underneath the pulpit for centuries, because it has failed to remain faithful to the wounded voices plus memories as they're shared, the narrative of blackness. What
the element that I want to draw out of this is that I would like to have more tools for analyzing white hermeneutics. I don't think that terminology was ever used in my training, right? We're back to the place where we were in the beginning, right? That some theology is just theology and these other things are not. And I'm pretty sure that it is it's going back for me recently to, I'm pretty sure it's an essay from Randall Bailey in a collected volume called Stony the Road We Trod, which is African American hermeneutics. And his lens of white hermeneutics that describes that it's not just the theologians, it's not just the preachers who employ a white hermeneutic, but that biblical scholars themselves, right? And Randall Bailey does this in terms of the stories of the peoples of Africa in the biblical text. And the way that white scholarship has said, well, it doesn't really mean people, it doesn't really mean Africans, it really means, people of part of the Mediterranean world. Or that the ways of thinking about the figures in the biblical text, oh, well, if they're African, that means they're disempowered. And he says, no, that's a white hermeneutic that's reading those expectations on the biblical story. And he says, let's reread those texts and let's see the African nations as really powerful peoples in the biblical account, right? So the only thing that I would add to the insight that's been posed is the realization of how deep the problem goes, right? That it's not just white theologians who are kind of making what they will out of the biblical text in their hermeneutical interpretations. It's the very structures of biblical interpretation that's coming from out of scholarship that is leaning in that white hermeneutical leaning in that way. But I think that there's a lot of work that we could do, right? And maybe that's one of the next steps, is really kind of thinking about theology as a discipline that has been formed in a white hermeneutic and the ways in which that itself needs to be decentered. Yeah.
Wow, thank you. Wow. We're almost 1 hour and a half. So I think we should stop now. But my question is, what next from here, Jeannine? If I may ask.
Yeah. It's an interesting question, both from a personal and a shared disciplinary perspective. The what next is, I think, a disciplinary one next on the one hand, right? How do we not have this as the end of the conversation once the Black Lives Matter protests kind of do the work that needs to be done, but how do we really transform our discipline, right? So there's a real what next in terms of transforming our discipline. The anti-racist organizing that I have been trained in asks us to think about ourselves as gatekeepers of that, right? The question a few moments back with the whole range of things that need to be done, right? Which of those things are things that I can do? Which of those, where in this big landscape is there work that I can undertake? And so thinking about, I think we already mentioned curriculum, thinking about the places where I, as a white theologian, need to expand my learning. But then in terms of professional and research trajectories, I'm listening to the ghosts of my own institution, right? And really asking questions about what resources were taken from people of color in this country and used to educate white people for the many centuries that, is it really centuries? The many years that my own institution, right, has been a predominantly white institution. So that opens up a whole lot of other conversations that Nindyo and I will have about where the ghosts are found, right? And how do I think about, or how do we think about our work as theologians within institutions that have benefited from various forms of white power, whether that's colonial power or the kinds of power that have been part of my own U.S. experience. So next steps are honestly continuing this conversation and finding those places that that I can do this work, in the company of others who will encourage us on. So I look forward to future conversations, but a lot of them are going to be through Nindyo, because he and I have a lot of conversations opening up in the future.
Well, thank you very much, Jeannine, for your time. I know that you have just finished from teaching and you you gave your time.
But you all know that this is where it's at. When we come together and we say, okay, we do this work individually, how do we bring ourselves together and do this work collectively? It's a real gift for me, right, to hear from you and to think about those places where we're pushing this work forward together. So I'm really grateful, Nindyo, to the invitation. I'm grateful to the 167 other episodes of this that you and the others have put their time into. I'm just appreciative to be part of it.
Right. Thank you. I mentioned to you back, I think 2 years ago, and here we are. We have you in our session. Thank you very much again, Jeannine.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for with us. Goodbye.
Goodbye.